Oh, Professor Mickelson, you're a hunk. Can I touch your muscles? Waking with a gasp, Mark found himself staring at an unfamiliar ceiling. Adjusting his position, his weight shifted on a soft bed in a very feminine room. It looked like something he would see in a grandmother's house. Floral prints and pastels smothered the space. It smelled of clean things, fresh linen overlaying a hint of mustiness. He smacked his lips. His mouth was dry, and a faint memory of a nightmare brushed in the back of his mind. Looking for a glass of water, he sat up and sharp pains stabbed his neck. Touching the tender spot, he felt for injury. His fingers met a rough bandage. Carefully lifting it, he felt 2 jagged punctures in his skin. It wasn't bleeding. He shook. What happened to him? Did someone stab his neck? A haziness fogged his mind. Each time he considered if there'd been anything strange last night, wisps of memory faded before it could take root. He remembered walking around campus at night, but he couldn't remember where he went afterwards. He had the impression he met Professor Mickelson, but he wasn't sure. As he stood, his knees buckled with exhaustion. Why was he so weak? Just what had he been up to last night when Professor found him? Mark trembled and hoped he was okay. His eyes adjusted to the dim house. A bright post-it note scribbled with Professor Mickelson's messy directions was on top of the end table. Come to the dining room when you wake. M. So, he had seen the professor. A quick image of shocking green hair came to his mind. Why was that? The more he tried to recall, the worse the blank spaces in his memory became. He shuffled out of the room, unsure where to go. A window revealed that he was inside a canary yellow frame house with chipped paint. The front yard had a few potted flowers which had received some attention. However, the rest of the sagging neighborhood outside the window looked as if it had been left behind the economic recovery. The owner had a unique taste. A retro 1950s couch sat in the entryway, surrounded by bold, flowery wallpaper. The quaint house looked like a place where a bunch of old ladies met to drink iced tea. Mark walked down a narrow hallway and paused before stepping into an elegant room decorated with jarring bright-coloured abstract paintings. Where was he? Harsh voices came from the next room.
Why did you bring him? You risk everyone's safety.
We need to move up the schedule. I've been seen.
Did I
He's in danger now and we don't have time to acclimate him.
Is there no other way?
Is there no other way?
There's none.
There's none. If we leave him as he
If
is,
we
he
leave
could
him
tell
as
someone
he
all the skulls
is,
will kill him.
He could
The code
tell
is already
someone.
broken.
Or
He's a child.
He's a child.
life
isn't fair. You of all people should
You
know
of
that.
all-
The voices lowered, and Mark couldn't hear the rest. He shivered. Were they talking about him? He pushed open the door to the next room and cleared his throat.
Excuse me?
At the sound of his voice, everyone in the next room turned and stared at him. Their keen eyes studied him as they sat with nonchalant positions around a mahogany table. He didn't know what was more impressive, the room or those gathered there. They had a presence to them, the type that only leaders command. They all were drinking a deep red wine. It seemed fitting in the formal dining room with the classical style paintings ascenting each wall. They were paler than the academic hermits he knew who spent all their days indoors. They didn't shift their stock-cold stares from him. Counting the professor, there were 4 of them. One was an elderly woman, another a young man, and a tall man in his 30s with black wavy hair. The professor's face softened at seeing Mark.
Professor, what's going on?
You were attacked last night.
I remember something about that. He bit me.
He ripped off his bandage, studding his wounds and the blooming bruise around them. An elderly woman at the opposite end of the room gasped.
Do you remember what happened next?
You saved me, I think.
I killed him.
Mark's eyes widened and he pushed the professor away. He started to breathe faster.
You better sit down.
Professor Mickelson guided him to the head of a long dining room table. Murder? Even if it was self-defense, someone would notice.
Oh God, what about the cops? They'll be looking for us, asking questions. What about the body?
His eyes darted back and forth across the room. No one responded with as much as a shrug. They remained unnaturally still, watching him, waiting for his next move.
There will be no body. Vampires typically turn to dust a few minutes after death. Newer ones, well, they're not in a state of decay yet. They need to be disposed of. I already took care of that.
His voice was oddly flat as he spoke and carefully studied Mark for a moment. Mickelson's remark apparently didn't register with his young TA.
Are you saying that you're some sort of vampire hunter?
Yes, in a way.
I believe you.
I believe you.
Mark thought about the night before, the fanged bloody smile, his bruises, the pain, his confusion as he was lifted off the ground and later thrown down like a worthless rag. His throat suddenly dried and constricted as he realized that yes, he was attacked by a vampire. An actual creature tried to kill him. Vampires were out there in the world. No one had a clue. The mist carefully hid the truth. That vampires were more than scary bedtime stories or the romanticized creatures googly-eyed girls gushed over. A chill went through his body.
And you killed this guy. Staked him.
Yes. And I'd do so again.
So, that's why I'm here, and not at the hospital.
You see? Mark is an intelligent young man. This was the safest place I could think of to bring you.
Mark tried to clear his throat before speaking again.
May I have some water?
Mickelson poured a glass from the water decanter on the table. He greedily drank as soon as the cool wetness touched his lips.
Professor, who are these people? How are they okay about this?
This is the Society of the Arts. Unfortunately, you were put in a situation where you had to meet them earlier than we expected. Everyone, this is Mark Delaware, my apprentice and protege.
How do you do, Mark? I'm the Society's president, Don Belmonte.
You're also a vampire.
Please, relax. You are safe here. Now would be a good time to meet everyone, I think, since we're all here. Unless you'd prefer to rest?
Ah, they were the people he'd interview with Friday. Mark sat a bit straighter. This was all strange, but nothing would be normal again after meeting a vampire. He looked around the table. They didn't seem disappointed that he lost against his fanged attacker. If this group was familiar with vampires, maybe he could inquire them for more information.
I'm fine. Just shook up, that's all.
Very understandable with what you experienced.
We've heard a lot about you. I'm Charlie Versier.
The young adult, Charlie, wore a fedora hat, canvas shoes, and could have easily passed as a fellow graduate student from St. George's. Belmonte looked a little bit older. A European accent lit his words.
I hear you practice judo, speak Francais and several other languages.
I understand that this is a society for the arts, that you support them and that you also trade art. From what Professor Mickelson told me, you're looking for a linguist. I practiced judo for 6 years. I also went abroad for a few semesters to focus on studying languages. I've also been learning Greek and Russian. Professor Mickelson was my classical history teacher.
Magnifique. Steve, I think you made an excellent choice. I like this one. Not that you need my approval. Mark, I think we'll be good friends. It's nice to have a younger face in this crowd, don't you think?
Charlie, what do you do in the society?
The society maintains and encourages the best arts of the era. I'm a musician. I've been so for over 300 years. I find those who grow that art. Belmonte looks for painters. Others who aren't here look for writers, sculptors, architects, fashion designers, etc. Mrs. Violet manages our books.
Mark thought he probably couldn't hear Charlie right. 300 years? Mickelson lowered his face and smacked his right palm against his forehead. The professor made an exasperated noise.
Yes, I've been playing the viola, the bass, and a stringed instrument, really. They've always been my favorite, but especially the piano. You meet the most women when you play a piano. My first instrument was a harpsichord. While we visited Europe, my father, a Dahomey prince, insisted that I should play it like Mozart. Of course, I was never able to come close to that young child. He always impressed the Austrian courts. Then, in the 20th century, I came to America and played jazz. I love jazz. I lived in New Orleans for many decades and picked up their accent when I learned English.
There he goes again, bragging without thinking.
Steve is our local enforcer. It is good that he chose a successor, although, as he said, the timing could have been better.
Mark was taken aback that he used Professor Mickelson's first name. They must have been good friends.
Enforcer? Wait, Professor Mickelson is like a vigilante?
Everyone around the table laughed, except for the elderly woman, who frowned.
He's our local hero.
And everyone here already knows about vampires.
It made sense. Professor Mickelson also shared that they participated in the art trade and much of the group's funding came from it. Maybe they ran into a few creatures while they were making a deal or when they found a rare piece. Yep, his imagination was running away. The frail elderly woman dressed in a tailored skirt suit, silver hair tightly wrapped in a bun, wore a tight-lipped expression. She didn't miss a thing. Straightening in a chair, she clipped her words.
Professor Mickelson, did you not properly tell your protege about the society?
Shocked expressions flickered around the table.
Mrs. Violet, I wanted to explain everything to him while we're together.
Mickelson said with a light smile, apparently to try and appease the old woman. Belmonte, the society president, narrowed his gaze.
I am normally not one to assert opinions, but don't you think it is not only dangerous, but also irresponsible to introduce him here and not mentally prepare him? The code has already been broken with this one.
Mark was quickly annoyed. For a woman that didn't normally assert opinions, Mrs. Violet easily made her own conclusions. Mickelson noticed Mark's frustration and motioned him to relax. Mark realized that he had been anxiously sitting on the edge of his high-backed chair.
Even if any of us disagree, it isn't our business anyway. It's Major Steve's decision, not yours.
As she laid her hand over Belmonte's wrist, Mrs. Violet softly asked,
Do you approve of the professor's choice?
The society president glanced at Mrs. Violet with warm eyes. He looked at her hand on his and gave her a gentle smile while rubbing his fingers over the back of her hands.
I do. Whatever our friend feels is best. He's lost his family. Having a new skilled apprentice might make things easier for Steve.
You never told me you'd lost your family.
It was a long time ago. It was inevitable. I'll tell you about that someday.
Steve, I'm glad to hear you found such a promising young man as your apprentice. It'll be good to have a more personal element in art negotiations. A good linguist is hard to come by. Yes, computers can translate, but in the future, it won't replace the human need to interact. His judo will aid him when other types of negotiations will get a little sticky. I assume you plan to teach him your special talents as well, Enforcer. Your professor is the enforcer of the Vampire Code. Our mask hides our secret. Only willing donors know our truth. Keep humanity alive, lest the enforcer declares judgment. All vampires follow this rule.
A shiver went through Mark. They were serious.
We want you to consider joining us. If the only reason you will join us is because you're desperate to find work, there are other ways we can help. Think about your decision. Being in a society is a lifelong commitment. Like a fraternity, our bonds last forever. Mickelson, would you please explain this to him?
The Society of the Arts is not just an organization to promote culture. We're a society of vampires. What some would call the undead, but don't let that word fool you. We're very much alive.
Mark chuckled nervously. Sometimes Mickelson would tell him a joke with a straight face. He had to be joking. Vampires? That's crazy. And Professor Mickelson is some sort of top cop? Mark felt the blood drain from his face. He thought back to the moments he enjoyed speaking with Professor Mickelson about vampires and their place in historical tales. He'd never minded those talks. In fact, he loved them. If vampires were real, Mark thought they'd make the world interesting. He'd even shared that with the professor. Maybe he should have kept his mouth shut. But those conversations and stories were supposed to be hypothetical. As he was lost in thought, Mark snapped back to the present when he noticed the others were staring at him, waiting for a response. Mark's collar felt snug around his throat and he pulled at it. After all, vampires are a myth.
You're scaring me. You're kidding, right, Professor? I mean, if you're all vampires, where are your fangs?
He gulped and realized he'd asked a room full of vampires to show him their teeth. Steve Mickelson frowned and looked offended.
If I'd suddenly told you I was a vampire and flashed a fanged smile, you'd run.
He was right. Mark knew that if he'd seen a toothy grin, he would have dashed outside fast as an all-star quarterback. Pushing back his chair, Mark was ready to do just that. He glanced behind him, prepared to sprint in case the society really had invited him over as dinner. He could see the headlines. College student vanishes after dinner party.
We're not the first vampires you've met.
No, this can't be real.
A sympathetic smile crossed Professor Mickelson's face.
Did your mind try to rationalize it as a bad dream? I'm sorry. You've seen the undead and are targeted by a very nasty vampire group called the House of Skulls. You must make a choice. Live as a donor, become one of us, or die. It is our code. I'm hoping you'll choose to be one of us.
Perhaps we'd better explain what is legend and what is truth to your student. It might make the adjustment easier.
What's there to say? He sees me daily. He knows that sunlight bothers me, but doesn't make me burst into flames. I don't walk beneath crucifixes, holy water takes away my strength, and he's never seen me eat.
Ugh, think about eating human food just makes me sick. It's awful.
We don't drink blood daily, and we can live well by only taking what we need without killing someone. People forget being bit pretty quickly. Something about our saliva heals both the mind and the flesh. Not every vampire is the same. Some force their donors to become victims. Like humans, there are good vampires and not so good ones.
Don't worry. Blood doesn't have to come from a person, but they taste better. Some humans volunteer to be our donors. They keep our secret for a price. I drink from a donor volunteer every week. Absolutely no longer than 1 month between bites. Otherwise, it's dangerous to be thirsty. Not biting makes you a little crazy.
Biting people sounded cannibalistic. Mark wondered if he was in over his head, but he was fascinated. Could they really do it? Get away with biting people every so often and not get caught? The idea that they didn't feed daily made it seem possible. A dark thought suddenly crossed his mind.
Did a vampire kill that student on campus?
A quick look of admiration crossed Mickelson's face.
You've always had keen insight. Yes, and you've met the master of her murderer before today.
That goth guy?
Mark pulled out his cell phone.
I need to tell my friends. Kyle and Ed are in trouble.
The professor grabbed his arm.
Think about what you're doing. Do you think they'll believe you if you start ranting about monsters? They'll think you're drunk. I only told you this to protect you. You're not supposed to be going around telling everyone. I thought you were ready for this. Was I wrong?
You just told me the impossible exists. What should I be feeling?
Sometimes danger is closer than we expect. If they're hanging around the skulls, then they might already be in over their heads. We don't know. I want to give you the opportunity to live like us. I'd become a permanent mentor to you. You'll have the chance to study centuries. That's all I'll share. If you decide to join us, then I'll explain the rest as you adjust to your new life. I want you to think about this.
And if I say no, that I don't want to become a vampire?
Professor Mickelson, I knew it was dangerous to bring this boy here. Child, you have no choice. If you reject us, you'll be killed by the House of Skulls. What? I'm not going to coddle the boy. He could also become a blood donor.
Unacceptable. No one is going to feed from Mark. I forbid it.
Careful, Steve. You may be the enforcer, but this is my society that you are speaking to.
Ma'am, I've been thinking, why was Professor Mickelson weak to holy water?
It drains us. Unless we have faith, we cannot get near religious objects. It is not painful, just uncomfortable.
We forsake any divine plan and choose not to live a mortal life.
But vampires live forever, right?
As long as we're not murdered or there's no major accident, we live for a very long time.
Hearing the facts from Mrs. Violet calmed Mark. But what she said bothered him. There was a thought and a warning poking in the back of his mind, but he couldn't remember something crucial about vampire law. Adjust? New life? It was hard for Mark to believe. Vampires shouldn't exist. Mark had never considered them real before. There was something in stories. Immortality was offered in front of Mark, and it tempted him. He hesitated. If he accepted the professor's offer, he'd be able to witness centuries. To become a scholar of humanity as ages passed. He'd also live as most men only dreamed, being young forever. But if Mark accepted the professor's offer, he'd also have to give up his normal life, including dates with Jodie. Mark figured it'd be impossible to hide vampirism from Jodie. He knew that he'd never aged like she would. He'd always be in his 20s. He'd have to give her up, and he didn't like that thought. Mark thought about his mother. Cancer sapping away her strength, her skin frail and cracked, her hair thinning and limp, her whispered words of love as she faded. No. He did not want death either. He didn't want to fade and disappear in the world, forgotten, forever lost.
Yes, I'll do it.
Charlie flashed a fanged smile.
This was not how I wanted to initiate Mark. A good teacher would allow his student time to adjust to the unknown.
You said it, not me. Glad we finally agree on something, Professor.
He raised his eyebrow at her. Pulling off his tweed jacket, Professor Mickelson hung it over his chair. He paused and looked at Mark. Oh, Professor Mickelson, you're a hunk. Can I touch your muscles?
Don't you need more time to think about it? Say clearly what you want, Mr. Delaware.
Mark's eyes snapped to his.
I want to become a vampire.
When do you want to do this? After graduation?
Professor, if I wait to make this decision, I'll change my mind. Please, do it now. I'm ready.
Good man. You'll join the society and work with them until you're ready to be like me. If you ever choose not to be an enforcer, then that is your right. Let's do this. I'll be the one to initiate you.
Yes. Bite me, Daddy Mickelson. Bite me.
As should be. He'll be your tyro.
Professor Mickelson unbuttoned his collar halfway down. He leaned over Mark.
Listen carefully or you'll die. The little bit of blood I gave you last time was nothing like what will happen now. When I drink from you, I will drain you. As I do, you'll feel lost in joy. Then you must drink from me. If you start feeling sad, whatever you do, don't stop. Keep drinking until I tell you no more. If you stop too early, you will die. The transformation takes 2 hours. This is the hardest part.
Mark nodded. The professor cast a red-rimmed stare at Mark. It almost unnerved the young man. He'd never seen the professor so intense. Is this what a vampire looks like before feeding? Suddenly, hands held Mark against his chair. They swiveled him around and he fought himself with looking straight up at the ceiling's white-swirled stucco. The society circled Mark with fangs exposed and a hungry look in their eyes. Mark felt the weight of his chair quickly lean forward. The professor staggered over him, crawled over his seat and pushed Mark's face against the chair. Mark tried to pull back, but he pushed harder. With his free hand, he tore Mark's collar and deeply bit into his neck. Pain jerked Mark's body and his blood poured out. Mickelson drank Mark's blood as his shirt stained red. Would he die before he transformed? Was it a mistake to trust them? Doubts circled in his head. Suddenly, a wave of emotion crashed into Mark. He sucked in air and was sent to spiritual euphoria. A feeling of pure joy washed over him as his body became too heavy to move. He was immobile, but didn't care. The steady rush of happiness engulfed him, and in passing thought Mark wasn't certain if it was because of the draining blood or the vampire's bite. Mark's breathing became shallow, and he shivered from a growing chill. He'd lost too much blood and was moments away from going into shock. The vampires stopped holding him down. Weak, Mark slumped, then found himself coaxed to sit upright. Once he had stopped drinking, the euphoria left him. He shivered and felt its loss. He wanted to feel that intense high again. He now understood why humans would be willing donors if a vampire's bite brought this kind of happiness, and he knew that soon he'd be able to give this kind of high to others. He realized he wanted that kind of power, if he didn't die from this first. All his thoughts became hazy. He began to fade. The professor studied his young student. Mickelson seemed different. He was not the same professor who wore tweed jackets and kept his hair brushed back. He looked like an escaped animal. The vampire's wild eyes stared at Mark's neck. He took a knife out of his pants pocket and slowly pulled open its blade. Mark shivered when he saw it, afraid Mickelson would change his mind and instead planned to finish him. Mark wanted to trust the professor, believe in him, but everything was far from anything he'd known. Steve Mickelson slid his hand along one of his shoulders and winced as he cut a horizontal gash deep into his skin. The professor placed the knife behind him and leaned forward, his blood dripping down his shirt. Mark flinched, grabbing the back of his head. Mickelson forced Mark towards the scarlet flowing from his body.
Don't hesitate. Drink!
He was moments from bleeding to death, and he'd have to trust that the Society of the Arts were not playing a cruel, sadistic prank. He placed his mouth against Mickelson's skin and swallowed. The vampire's blood was disgusting, thick, and tasted rotten. Mark choked, spitting it out. He shook his head.
You're a fool!
Mickelson insulted as he forced Mark's face against his shoulder.
You cannot stop! You must drink! Quickly!
Mark stopped gagging and swallowed the awful taste. His mind cleared. The earlier fuzzy forgetfulness left him in a rush. His focus came snapping back. Then sadness came. At first it was a little. Tears ran down Mark's face and he sobbed as he drank. That feeling grew to sorrow, then depression, then the deepest despair. It drowned him. The amount of joy he felt earlier was nothing compared to this sadness. This depression weighed him down as though a boulder had dragged him from far beneath an ocean's waves. He felt as if he'd lost everything. His family, his friends, his future. But the feeling was 10 times worse. He was in agony and he wanted to die. A feeling of separation slammed into him. Mark gasped. It felt as if his spirit was ripped out, as though the center of his being was torn in two. It physically hurt. He wanted it to return, whatever it was that he'd lost. Replacing that fullness was a hollow emptiness. He didn't know where it came from, but he knew he lost something important. He wondered if his sadness was somehow linked to that feeling of separation. Suddenly, he became afraid of the choice he'd made. However, Mark continued to drink Mickelson's blood. Eventually, through the tears, Mark felt stronger and stopped shivering. His sorrow faded, but the emptiness remained. Mickelson exhaled.
You can stop now. You did well, Mark. The first step of the transformation isn't easy. The next part of the transformation isn't pleasant, but you'll feel nothing like the sadness you felt earlier.
Visibly weakened, the professor grinned. Mark grinned too, with the satisfaction that he, no, somehow they, had made it. Sticky blood covered Mark's mouth and throat. He knew he should have been horrified at himself, but he wasn't. He was emotionally exhausted. The moment he stopped drinking from the professor, the sadness had left. Finally, Mark, freed from despair, was too weak to enjoy the moment. He collapsed. Professor Mickelson caught him before he fell to the floor. Charlie tried to pick up the new vampire, but the enforcer stopped him with a growl.
He's my apprentice. My tyro. I found him. I formed him. I'll carry him.
In one jerk, Mickelson picked Mark up. Charlie passed him in the hallway as Mickelson brought Mark into a corner bedroom near the house's entrance. Mark struggled to remain conscious when Charlie helped Mickelson by removing Mark's shoes. The two vampires left Mark lying on the bed, alone in the room to suffer the rest of the transformation. Through groggy eyes, Mark watched Professor Mickelson sink to his knees as he stepped out of the doorway. Belmonte approached and helped Charlie drag Mickelson away. Mark thought that for a moment he could feel the professor's exhaustion and wondered if the impression was his imagination or simply sympathy. He figured he was overthinking things. Worn out, Mark fell asleep.
Dumb things on stream, so many dumb things.